Hello, and welcome to the Transforming Loneliness interview series. I'm Laura Parker, the creator and host of the series. Transforming Loneliness approaches loneliness with fresh and unexpected ways of seeing and responding that cultivate connection, belonging, and love. Today, I'm thrilled to be with Frances Weller. Frances Weller is a psychotherapist, writer, and soul activist. Author of The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal, and the Sacred Work of Grief, he has introduced the healing work of ritual to thousands of people. I'm so grateful for Frances's dedication to keeping soul alive in the world. One thing I love about Frances is the way his use of language confounds our conventional thinking and takes us into a very deep, connected, and powerful place inside. Welcome, Frances, and thank you for joining the conversation.
It's a very deep pleasure to be with you again, Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's just get started then with, what do you think the relationship, that's not the question I want to ask. What do you mean by tending grief?
Well, most of what we're taught about grief leads us more towards endurance. How do I get through this? How do I get beyond this time of sorrow? Hoping to find the exit, hoping to get to the other side of it as quickly as possible. Tending grief, what I mean by that is, how do we turn toward the suffering? How do we turn towards the sorrow? Almost more in a way of befriending it, of inviting a lasting relationship with it. And part of what I mean by tending sorrow is a recognition that sorrow is never far from our doorstep. It's always in the atmosphere. It may not be my grief, but it may be the community grief. It may be the cultural grief. It may be the environmental grief that we're so acutely aware of now. There's never a day, in a sense, in which the scent of sorrow isn't in the air somewhere. And if I am attuned to that, that keeps me connected to the larger breath of the world. And tending grief also is a way of making sure that I am sensitive to the rhythms of the heart and the soul. When I'm caught in that endurance mode, I'm much more in a guarded and protected state from the world, from sorrow. And so my heart, in a sense, closes down. The value of tending grief is that the heart stays fluid, soft, responsive, reflexive, open, not only to my sorrows, but to the sorrows of friends and family, the sorrows of the world. And that's precisely what we need right now, are adult human beings whose hearts are open and capable of registering not only sorrows, but also the beauty of this world.
Yeah. So you've said so much there that I could respond to. I was really struck by the word beauty there. But before I go there, I wanted to ask about this endurance mode, and how do you turn away from the endurance mode and turn toward the befriending? How does one do that?
That requires a sense of permission. Now, we live in what I call a very heroic culture. We're always supposed to be in control, always able to rise above the sorrows, troubles, pains, suffering that's going on. We're also kind of psychologically focused so much on happiness that when sorrow comes around, it feels like somehow it's a failure. Like somehow I'm not measuring up. I'm not able to perform at that optimal level. And psychology colludes with this, and I think in a very almost punitive way. So we have to have a much more generous atmosphere around our sorrows. So how do we turn toward it? How do we begin to loosen the grip of that endurance? Well, it's very helpful to begin to risk revelation. Begin to talk about your grief to another human being, not just a therapist, but to a friend, to your partner. Uh, there's no one you're ever going to meet walking down the street who's not carrying their own pocket full of losses and grief.
Yeah.
But we're always taught to carry this kind of facade of being above it or not being touched by it. I'm in control. I've got this one. Grief takes us down. It's a field of emotion that has a gravity to it that takes us to our knees. And in a heroic culture, we're always supposed to be rising. We don't like this movement downward.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us anxious. It
Yes.
frightens us, and it also makes us feel ashamed. So part of what we're trying to do in our work with grief is begin to see it as the commons of the soul. This is something we all share. When we gather for our grief rituals, the opening circles, when people begin to name the threads of sorrow that have walked in the door with them, we can relate to them all. I might not have had yours, but I can relate to sorrow in you. And it brings us together in a very deep way. I have found that our grief, sharing grief, to be one of the most profoundly healing gestures we can make with one another.
Thank you. And again, as you're talking, I'm hearing so many parallels with loneliness. For example, one of the thoughts that I just had yesterday was, why don't we talk about our loneliness with each other? It's like it's an infectious disease we have, and we don't want to admit it somehow, and yet it's so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So
Yes.
there's so many parallels.
Well, I think wherever loneliness is, as we've said before, sorrow is certainly, folded into its cloth. It's right there. To be lonely is to be touched by sorrow.
Can you say more about how you're seeing that connection?
Well, I think the core wound in the culture is around belonging. It is, we live chronically around this tension between inclusion and exclusion. Am I in or am I out? And if we had a lot of time, I would talk more about kind of what traditional cultures hold as their core value, is a core value around belonging. And it was the job of the village, of the community, to impress into the body of every child arriving there that they were somebody of worth and of necessity. They were needed.
Yes.
That they were valued, that they belonged. That was the job of the village, to put that into the body of the child. We've inverted that 180 degrees, where it's now up to me to prove to you that I'm somebody worthy of even a provisional sense of belonging. And the belonging now is predicated totally on performance. How did I do? Did I impress you? Did I give you what you wanted? Did I look good enough? Was I, adequate? That's not the true sense of belonging. And what we need for belonging is to be known thoroughly. There has to be some process by which we are revealed repeatedly. Our beauties and our failures, our successes and our defeats, our gifts and our wounds. The whole range of it has to be found to be receptive to a body of people. And when that part of us is not welcomed, those difficult pieces, when we're only supposed to show the shiny face, even if we get a message of welcome, we don't trust it, because so much of us has had to go into hiding. That's what I call the second gate of grief, the parts of us that have never known love. My neediness, my weakness, my failures, my shame, my inadequacy, whatever those parts of my sensuality, my imagination, whatever it was that was not made welcome in family, education, or culture, those are pushed out. They are marginalized. And our loneliness is deeply connected to the feeling that I cannot show you all of who I am, or I will once again reinforce my experience of being rejected, abandoned, exiled.
Mm.
So again, all of those things weave together into this coat of lonely sorrow or sorrowful loneliness. They are so woven together.
Yes, yes. And what you mentioned about the indigenous culture, what I'm hearing is there's an absence of the village that could
Yes,
impress upon us this sense of worth and necessity. I was very struck by those two words, feeling that our presence is necessary from
yes,
birth, not based on what we've proven later in life, but just by the virtue of the fact that we were born.
correct, correct. You came here. This is a very old indigenous idea that you came here bearing gifts. And it is up to us to somehow coax them out because we can't be a village without your gift. You are utterly necessary for us to be who we are. We talk about it in terms of getting a career. Now, a career is fine to have, but it may have nothing to do with why you came here. It may have nothing to do with the essential nature of your blessing for the community.
Yes. And so, and I can just see how much the world needs our gifts now, more than ever.
More than ever.
And how do we go about, what are some of your ideas about how we go about recreating that village, finding our way back to that essential function?
I think that's one of the core questions of our age, which is how do we begin to uh, reimagine the fabric of belonging. So what we do in our work is when we gather, even for 3 days, we say, for this time, we are in what we call a sudden village. We may not know each other, but by the time we leave here, you will have felt some quality of kinship because of the territory that we have traveled in. We will go into those shadowed lands together, places where shame and loneliness, grief and sorrow have really been dwelling. And by our mutual engagement, we will begin to recognize our mutual entanglement, that we are all in this together.
Mm.
And by so doing, we begin to repair the loneliness. We begin to suture the tear in our coat of belonging. We begin to feel that we're part of something larger than our own mind, our own interior space. Psychology is wonderful. I love interiority. I love the magic and beauty and mystery of our own singular lives. But that's just the in-breath. We also need the exhalation.
Ah.
We need to extend out. It's what I call the twining trail. The soul came here for sovereignty and intimacy. It came here to declare who it is singularly, but it also came here to participate intimately. And that's the tension that a human being lives between my singleness and my belonging, constantly weaving back and forth across that braid, coming in and out of connection and solitude.
Yeah, and it seems like what you're saying is that our culture's better at the in-breath. Is that what
Oh,
you're
much,
saying?
much better. Yeah, I think that psychology has become a very introverted practice. Again, nothing wrong with that, but it's only half of the story. If we think about grief work, grief has never been private. In our long story as a species, grief has always been communal. And all of the practices we're learning, meditation, um, self-regulation, they're all very interior practices. I was at a program not too long ago for one of my classes on CEU classes. It was on neuropsychology and learning how to regulate trauma states and so forth. And it's all very good, very necessary work. How do you get out of these trauma states and learn to regulate your nervous systems? But then I realized, well, for several 100,000 years, Ritual was the communal regulating system to deal with traumas and dysregulation. When something happened in the village, it was ritual. It was the community that helped to recalibrate and reestablish some sense of okayness, even in the midst of great loss, great sorrow. We are still being held by something large.
Mm.
That's the piece that's missing primarily in our psychological imagination is where does community lie? Where does the village come into our psychological well-being? Not just based on what I've done internally, but what is the overlap between the exhalation and the inhalation?
Have you come across, I know you're creating community in your rituals. Are there other ways of creating community and ritual that you've come across that you might want to let our audience know about? Or is it just really rare and it's just hard to find?
Well, there's other people doing work. Joanna Macy certainly has been doing grief ritual work for decades. Michael Mead. There are certainly groups that are trying to re-envision this. Stephen Jenkinson, Martine Prechtel. These are all people who see the need to come back into some measure of communal response, that we cannot process our way out of this, we cannot psychologize our way out of this. My friend Malidoma Some, who I studied with, and then we taught together for quite a few years, shared out that there's a word in his village from West Africa. The word is Ilbangura. And the word means the things that knowledge cannot eat. And grief and loneliness,
No.
we cannot think our way out of that.
No, they don't get processed by the mind.
No, this is heart work. This is soul work. This is communal work.
Can you share a little bit more then about how that heart work and soul work and communal work actually happens, and how does it work us in a way that our grief or our loneliness moves?
Well, part of what it initially does, Laura, is that it breaks the trance of privatization. Like, this is my wound, this is my suffering, this is my sorrows. When we begin to sit in circle and you begin to hear the revelations of other people's experience, you begin to sense that this is our grief. We share a communal cup of sorrow. We share a communal bond of loneliness. And if we can begin to end the sanctioned, privatized experience and come more into a communal sense that this is ours, and it can only be responded to in some ways in a communal setting, that we can begin to free ourselves from the trap, kind of, in a sense, the solitary confinement of privatization. We privatize everything in this culture. And psychology, again, says, own your feelings. This is yours.
Yeah.
Well, what if it's more like William Blake said, it's more like a divine influx? Maybe it's something touching me. Maybe it's an arrival. Maybe it's a presence coming close by that I'm supposed to be a good host to, and offer generosity, kindness, warmth, and compassion to. Then we might have an entirely different response to it.
Sure. That seems like a very important function of ritual. And I can see how hard it is to break that habit of the solitary confinement.
Yeah, it is, again, another part of the lasting echo chamber of that heroic model. Do it yourself. Buck up, show up, do it yourself. And that has had a lasting impact, particularly on men, but I also see it in women.
Yeah.
Where we are really deprived of what it is we truly need to come back into some sense of being held by something bigger than my own will and my own, self-engineered muscle.
Yes.
We need a bigger holding space for that.
Yes, we do. You mentioned earlier, you talked about how the second gate of grief is, I can't remember exactly what you said. Can we revisit that topic of the gates of grief that actually pertain to loneliness? Or actually, maybe you might want to first say what you mean by the gates of grief.
Sure. Yeah, I've felt that there are like at least 5 gates of grief. The first one is the one that we all know, which is to lose something or someone that we love. And we will all have that happen in our lifetime. We will lose parents, we'll lose siblings, we might lose a spouse, a child, we might lose a friend, we might lose a home or a marriage. We'll lose something that we love. That's the first gate. The second gate has to do with those parts of us that have never known love.
Mm-hmm.
I'll come back to that in a second.
Okay.
The third gate is the sorrows of the world. And they're circulating around us more and more potently as we go day by day through our world. The disappearance of glaciers, the species eradication, disappearance, extinction, cultures being silenced, languages disappearing. This is happening at a rapidly increasing rate. That's the third gate. The fourth gate is another part of our loneliness, which has to do with what we expected and did not receive. So some part of us, as I was mentioning the village before,
Mm-hmm.
some part of us is wired to expect that when we got here.
Yeah.
We expected by our own evolutionary story to receive the same welcome, the same intention, the same attention that our deep time ancestors shared with one another. And almost none of that showed up. So in the absence of multiple reflections, like in the morning, we were expecting maybe 40 pairs of eyes looking back at us and saying, "What did you dream last night? Let's go get some firewood. Let's share a meal. Tonight there's going to be a ritual to give gratitude for a good hunt," or whatever. We expected all of that, in communal context, and almost none of that showed up. So I'm sure in your own practice, you've sat with people who lament this feeling of emptiness inside of them. I feel empty inside. And we privatize that emptiness. What did I do wrong to feel empty? Well, what if the emptiness is an absence? Where a fullness we should have encountered this fullness of all of the things that village offers. So that's a huge part of our grief. We don't even know how to name that. It's almost unnameable in our minds because we don't even know that we should have expected that.
It can be categorized as just, oh, something's missing.
Something's missing, yes. What did I do wrong? I must have missed something, I didn't get the instruction manual, something's wrong with me. No, something is wrong, definitely, but it's a profound cultural failure to give and offer each of us what it is we require to feel sane and to feel like we belong here. That's the anxiety we carry our whole life. We stay caught really in an adolescent posture almost our entire existence. Am I good enough? Do I belong? Am I lovable? Am I enough? Those are all adolescent questions that in a sense we never really resolve. That's a huge part of that. Again, the expectation was also for some kind of initiation, some kind of formal introduction into the land of sacred, land of ancestors, and the land of duty. This is where my necessity comes into play. Why I was needed here is because I have a role to play in the sustaining of culture. The first job is for culture to sustain me, but then it's my job to sustain culture. There's supposed to be this beautiful mutual entanglement between the two, and that's all but fallen apart.
Yes, I love that concept of reciprocity, of giving and receiving. And we're such in a culture where we just think we're supposed to take, which I guess is the in-breath,
Well, it's also how do you cope with that emptiness?
Ah, yes.
In the absence of something that what I call primary satisfactions, the things that really satisfy psyche and soul, in the absence of that, there's a profound hunger. And so we are the most consumptive culture the planet has ever seen. And there's a relationship between that emptiness that loneliness,
Most
that,
definitely.
that fourth gate, and our ravenous appetite for more. And we can never, ever be satisfied with secondary satisfactions.
Right.
And
Yes.
just quickly, the last gate of grief is ancestral grief. What it is, what happened to our deep time ancestors that, first of all, broke off a relationship to land and place and ritual and language and customs and traditions, food, and we lost much of that. And then what happened to when our ancestors got here, this continent, to the indigenous cultures, to the importation of slavery, what happened to the environment, those are all also parts of the grief that we carry. We carry a lot of grief.
We do, and so what you're saying there is the grief of what we've done, the genocides,
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that you wanted to come back to the second gate. Is there more you want to say about that?
Yeah, the second gate has to do again with those parts of us that we were taught were unwelcomed in the world. So if I was a particularly sensitive young boy and cried a lot, I may have been told quite vigorously that my tears are not welcome here. So I might have had to do a very good job of kind of cauterizing my sensitivity, my tears, my sadness, and gotten rid of those parts of me. Then I might have had to get rid of my maybe my joy, because those two are very connected. Sadness and joy are very reciprocal. I might have had to get rid of my needing others. I might have had to silence my exuberance in a family that really required us to be more like in a flat line, not too high, not too low, just in the middle ground. So every part of us that we had to cut away, we are basically told that these are unworthy parts of us. They are unacceptable. And so we cleave them off. We send them into exile, into the wasteland. Now, every one of these losses is a loss to our wholeness, to our integrity, and is, in a sense, a place where grief should be expressed. But we cannot grieve for what we hold with contempt. This is what walks in the door of therapy every single day. We're dealing with loss primarily, the loss of huge swaths of our being. And why it's so hard to bring these parts back is we were taught to hate them. We were taught to hold them with judgment and contempt. And we cannot heal what we hold with judgment. We cannot grieve, which is the proper response to loss, right? That would be the proper response to losing these parts of us. But we can't grieve for what we're holding with hatred or judgment. So part of therapy and part of the work that happens in grief settings is the reparation between us and these exiled parts of us, what I call the outcast brothers and sisters. How do we slowly begin to become a place of welcome again for these parts of us?
Yes, so that brings me to just a final question. How can we begin to be a place of welcome for these? And this dovetails with the question about how can people who don't necessarily have access to a grief ritual, how can they begin to tend grief? And I think these two go together. Yeah, how can we start to be a place of welcome for these outcast brothers and sisters?
Yeah, that's a fundamental question, and the core practice is self-compassion. To really, what shame does, what loneliness does, is it tends to close the heart to itself. And what we have to do is begin to open the heart back up to our own experiences of loss and suffering. So we have to do what I call a Jane Goodall. We have to go out and begin to make amends to those parts of us that we sent away. It may not have been caused by us, but we have certainly maintained the exile over the years. So I have to go sit out there just like Jane had to do. She, the chimps didn't come running up to her on the first day. Hey, it's Jane Goodall. They said, who is this one? What does she want? And it took days, weeks, months of patience so they could begin to trust her again. So these parts of us that have gone into exile, they become somewhat feral. So we have to become a good host again, and to go out and sit with these outcasts and say, look, I am so utterly sorry that I blamed you for my not fitting in. That I blamed you for my feelings of not belonging in this world. You had nothing to do with that. You were simply told that you were too much in the environment that we were in. And if there's any way you could begin to come back home, I have warm tea and hot soup and a soft bed for you, just to begin to coax them in. And then in the out breath, we would say to 2 or 3 friends that, you know, I don't imagine you or I or anyone we know have been spared loss. But it's rarely talked about. How about Friday night, we get together and the topic will be loss or loneliness, grief, and sorrow. But let's make some agreements. Let's not try to offer one bit of advice. Let's not try to fix anybody's loneliness or sadness or grief. These are parts of us that don't need fixing. They need witnessing. They need accompaniment. They need to begin to feel like I'm not standing alone in this place. But there are actually others who share the same secret story of loneliness or sorrow. And maybe in our confiding in one another, we can come back into a felt sense that we are being held by something larger, and perhaps something with a little more elegance and a little bit more beauty, and certainly a lot more kindness than how we've been able to hold it by ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. I'm very struck by the way that through that action of, you know, you use the words making amends, and I'm seeing it as a form of courtship.
Yes.
And being in that relationship of patience and attending, that puts our body and our mind in such a different form of relationship from the contempt you were talking about before. So I think that's the key, is to be approaching it in this other way. But I love the fact that you've mentioned a very active thing that people can do, rather than kind of make some kind of mental shift in their mind, you know?
Ritual does not have to be complex. It can be very simple. You can light a candle together, you can share a poem together, and then you can begin to share your stories and deeply listen to one another. Again, without trying to fix anything, but really to become a place of hospitality to one another's loneliness, one another's sorrow. If we can do that, we can begin to mend great things.
Yes, so I think this is a beautiful place for us to end. I just want to underline what you said, because I'm going to be taking these forward in my life, and I hope that some of our listeners feel inspired to do the same, which is this, what you said about sharing a poem, don't fix, provide hospitality, and deeply listen. So thank you, Francis.
It was a pleasure, Laura. Thank you for doing what you're doing around this great project.
You're welcome. It is my deep pleasure, and it is my way of being necessary and responding to a call that I heard. Before we end, I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you want to let our audience know about what you're doing in the world, and anything that they might be interested in knowing about?
If they'd like to stay current with what I'm doing out in the world, where I'm talking or teaching or workshops, they can always go to wisdombridge.net or to my personal website, francisweller.net. Lots of things that we're doing, and they unfortunately often fill up fast, as you just mentioned before we got on the air here. But yeah, it's a great way for them to stay connected.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for the wonderful work that you're doing in the world.